Are you ready to fall asleep to these scary stories? Before you fall asleep, make sure you subscribe to my channel and like this video. And don't forget to tell me in the comments what time you're watching and where you're watching from. Sleep well. I remember the moment we decided to camp in those mountains. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. My friend Marcus and I had been planning this trip for months, talking about the solitude, the crisp air, the feeling of being truly alone in nature. We packed our gear into the car on a Friday afternoon, and by evening, we'd found a clearing in the Appalachian wilderness that felt perfect. The trees surrounding us stood like ancient sentries, their branches reaching toward a sky that was already turning purple with the approach of night. Setting up camp felt routine, almost comforting. We pitched our tent with practiced efficiency, arranged our sleeping bags, and prepared a simple dinner over the fire. Marcus kept making jokes about bears and haunted forests, but his voice had that edge to it, the kind of nervous energy that comes when you're far from civilization. I laughed along, but I noticed how the darkness seemed to creep closer with each passing minute, swallowing the light from our fire inch by inch. The forest around us was never truly quiet. There were rustles and distant calls, the normal sounds of wildlife that we'd expected to hear. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the night had become complete and absolute. The temperature had dropped more than we'd anticipated, and we huddled in our gear, talking in hushed voices about nothing in particular. I was beginning to drift towards sleep, that pleasant heaviness settling over my body, when Marcus suddenly went silent. I could feel the change in his breathing, the way his entire body seemed to tense beside me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I hadn't, but now my ears were straining into the darkness, searching for whatever had caught his attention. At first, there was nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees and the ambient sounds of the forest at night. Then it came a sound so piercing, so utterly wrong in that wild place, that my heart seemed to stop in my chest. It was a scream, but not like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was high and desperate, carrying an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. The scream cut through the night like a blade, echoing off the mountainsides and multiplying, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Marcus's voice cracked as he spoke, barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I couldn't answer because I didn't know. The scream came again, longer this time, more agonized, and I felt my body go rigid beneath my sleeping bag. My mind began spinning through possibilities, each more terrible than the last. Had someone wandered into these mountains injured? Was there an accident nearby? Every rational thought seemed to slip away, replaced by a primitive fear that had no name. Marcus's hand found mine in the darkness, gripping so tightly it hurt. The minutes that followed felt like hours. We lay there, barely breathing, waiting for the scream to return. And it did, again and again, at irregular intervals that prevented us from settling into any kind of acceptance or logic. Each time, our bodies would jolt, every nerve ending firing at once. I wanted to believe it was an animal, some creature we simply didn't recognize, but the sound was too articulate, too laden with what seemed like pain and terror. We didn't speak after that first exchange. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. Around midnight, we considered leaving. Marcus suggested we pack up immediately and drive down the mountain in the dark, but the road was treacherous, and neither of us felt capable of navigating it safely in our current state. So we remained, trapped in our tent, listening to every sound the forest made with exaggerated intensity. Some noises seemed threatening, others almost comforting in their familiarity, but the scream had poisoned the night. It had made the entire forest feel hostile and alive with unknowable danger. I must have dozed off at some point, though I couldn't say when or for how long. My sleep was fractured and filled with strange dreams that mixed with the real sounds around us. When I woke, my mouth was dry and my muscles ached from tension. Marcus was awake too. I could tell by the way he was staring at the tent ceiling, completely motionless. The forest had gone quiet again, that deceptive quiet that felt almost more frightening than the screams. We didn't attempt to sleep again after that. We simply waited for dawn to arrive. The hours between 3 and 5 in the morning are peculiar when you're awake and afraid. Time moves differently. Minutes stretch like taffy, and you become hyper-aware of every small sound and sensation. I found myself analyzing the silence, wondering if the creature, whatever it was, had moved on, or if it was simply watching, waiting just beyond the circle of our campsite. The darkness outside our tent seemed to have weight and texture, as if it could press against the nylon and break through if it wanted to. When the first hint of gray began creeping into the sky, it felt like a victory. Marcus and I worked without speaking, quickly packing our gear with shaking hands. We didn't bother with breakfast or a proper breakdown of camp. We just wanted to get out. As we threw our bags into the car and started down the mountain, the early morning light revealed nothing out of place. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no explanation. The forest looked almost peaceful in the pale dawn, completely ordinary, as if the terror of the night had been some kind of shared hallucination. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Neither of us knew what to say that wouldn't sound ridiculous. By the time we reached civilization, the whole experience already felt distant, dreamlike, something that couldn't have really happened. That night, after a long shower and a few stiff drinks, I posted about it online. I wasn't even sure why, maybe to prove it had been real, or maybe to see if anyone else had ever heard something similar in those mountains. The post got a few curious comments and skeptical jokes. I went to bed still unsettled, the memory of that scream looping in my mind. The next morning, I checked my phone and saw a new reply. It was from someone who claimed to live near that same area of the Appalachians. Those screams you heard? Probably a mountain lion. Their calls can sound exactly like a woman screaming. Scared the hell out of me the first time, too. I stared at the message for a long time. Somehow, that explanation didn't make me feel any better. Because knowing it was real, that it had been out there, watching us, unseen in the dark, was worse than not knowing at all. The first time I saw the ridge, I thought it looked like a sleeping giant. It stretched along the horizon, massive, still, and dark against the dying light. The trees grew so thick along its back that even in early autumn, the sun couldn't quite reach the ground. My uncle used to tell me that the ridge was old, not just geologically, but spiritually. Older than people, he'd say, as if that explained anything. I always thought he was just trying to keep me from wandering too far when I visited him in western North Carolina. That was before I inherited his cabin. It sat in a small clearing at the foot of that same ridge. After he passed, I drove up to sort through his things and maybe fix it up enough to rent out. I figured it'd be a quiet weekend, some solitude, some memories, maybe a few beers by the fire. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt watched. Not the paranoid kind of watched, something heavier. Like the woods themselves were aware of me. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and dust. Everything was just as he'd left it. The old hunting rifle on the wall, a half-finished crossword on the table, and a small stack of notebooks on the counter. They were filled with my uncle's shaky handwriting, pages and pages of notes about wildlife, the weather, and something he called the Watchers. I skimmed through one entry that night. They don't come down when the lights are on. Don't whistle after dark. Don't look directly toward the ridge if you hear them moving. I laughed it off. He'd spent decades alone up here. It made sense that he'd start imagining things in the shadows. By the second night, the laughter stopped. I'd been out on the porch, drinking and listening to the crickets. Around midnight, the woods went dead quiet. Not gradually, the sound just cut out, as if someone had hit a switch. Then I heard footsteps. Not animal steps, footsteps. Slow, pacing along the tree line at the edge of the clearing. I called out, thinking maybe it was a hiker or a neighbor. Nothing. The steps paused for a few seconds, then continued just out of sight. I turned on my flashlight and swept the beam toward the sound, but the light seemed to dissolve in the dark. It didn't reach far enough. It was like the darkness there had depth, like you could drown in it. The sound stopped. Then came a whistle. It was soft at first, rising and falling in a strange, uneven pattern. Not any tune I recognized. The sound seemed to circle the clearing, moving from one side to the other. My skin prickled. Something about it felt wrong, mocking, almost human, but not quite. I stumbled back inside, slammed the door, and locked it. The whistling stopped the moment I turned off the porch light. I didn't sleep much. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something brushing against the cabin walls, light and rhythmic, like fingers dragging along wood. When dawn finally came, I opened the door to look around. Nothing. No tracks, no damage. The woods looked exactly as they always had, quiet, green, indifferent. I told myself I'd imagined it. That lasted until the third night. I was sitting at the kitchen table, reading one of my uncle's notebooks by lantern light, when I came across a passage dated only a few weeks before he died. They've been closer lately. I stopped shining lights toward them. It only makes them angry. When the whistling starts, I don't move. I don't look. I just wait until morning. Before I could process that, I heard it again. The same uneven whistling, drifting in from the ridge. But this time, it was closer, maybe 20 feet from the cabin wall. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. The sound stopped for a moment, then repeated slower, like it was testing me. I remembered the note. Don't look. But of course, I looked. Through the window, between two trees, I saw something standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin, too tall for a person. Its limbs were long, jointed wrong, and it swayed slightly, as if breathing. I couldn't make out a face, only the pale oval of its head turning toward the light. Then, in perfect imitation of my own voice, it whispered, "Don't look." I dropped the lantern. The glass shattered, plunging the cabin into darkness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The next thing I heard was the slow retreat of footsteps, disappearing back toward the ridge. I left before sunrise. When I got to town, I told a ranger I'd heard something strange. He just nodded, said a lot of people reported weird noises up near that ridge. Echoes, he called them. Sound carries funny in the mountains. We'd been out on the Appalachian Trail for just over 2 weeks. Enough time for the world to shrink down to boots, breath, and trees. The deeper into the woods we hiked, the more everything else seemed to fall away. Cities, jobs, even names felt smaller out here. It was just me and my friend, moving northbound, chasing that late fall window before the frost crept in too deep. The leaves had already begun their slow, fiery death, burnt orange and deep reds crunching underfoot with every step. Mornings were cold, breath visible in the air, but our pace always warmed us quickly. We'd talk sometimes, mostly nonsense, sometimes not at all. Long silences didn't feel strange in the woods. The forest didn't rush us. It had its own pace, older and quieter than anything we'd known. We'd pass through empty gaps of forest where the canopy arched above like cathedral ceilings. Other times it closed in tight, all bramble and pine, making you feel watched even when you weren't. But that day, something in the air felt heavier, though neither of us said a word about it. We were a few miles past a trail junction, somewhere in a long, flat stretch with no recent shelters or side trails. The wind had quieted, and even the birds seemed reluctant to speak. It was the kind of stillness that made you realize how much you rely on background noise to feel safe. A silence so full it felt unnatural, like the forest itself was pausing to listen. We pressed on, but slower now, our voices trailing off as we listened without meaning to. That's when I first noticed it. A sound not quite like ours, but almost. Footsteps. Not loud, not rushed, just following. They came in softly, like someone walking barefoot just behind us, matching our rhythm step for step. I turned around, nothing. Just a long tunnel of trees stretching back into shadow. I told myself it was echo, maybe even wind, but I knew better. I didn't say anything right away. What would I even say? That the woods were echoing back sounds that didn't belong to us? That something was pacing us through the trees, just out of sight? Instead, I just looked over my shoulder again, scanning the trail for movement. There was none. But the feeling stuck, the quiet tension of being not alone. The next time I heard the steps, I stopped suddenly. My friend walked a few paces before realizing. He looked back at me, puzzled. "What's up? You hear that?" I asked, keeping my voice low like we weren't the only ones who could hear. He tilted his head, then shrugged. "Hear what?" And before I could answer, the steps stopped. We walked on, but my nerves were starting to fray. Every few dozen yards I'd glance back, waiting for the shape that wasn't there. When the footsteps returned, they were louder, just barely, and unmistakable. That soft crunch of leaves beneath a boot or something like one. Again, perfectly in step, a mirror, a mimic. I stopped again, and so did they. I turned, and again, nothing. But this time, I caught a change in my friend's face. He'd gone quiet, too quiet, and the color had drained from him. "What is that?" he asked, voice tight, eyes wide. Now he could hear it. We picked up the pace, not running but faster, speaking less and listening more. The steps came with us, never catching up, never falling behind. It felt like walking with a shadow, one just barely out of reach. No rustling through brush, no sound of breath, just those steps. And when we stopped, they stopped, always. I yelled once, just to shatter the rhythm. "Hey, who's there?" Silence swallowed the sound like it had never been spoken. My friend looked at me, then at the trail behind us. "You think it's messing with us?" he asked. I didn't have an answer I wanted to say out loud. The footsteps continued for nearly a mile, never more than 20 or 30 feet behind us. Sometimes they faded slightly, then surged back like breathing, but always in rhythm, always in time. Not running, not sneaking, just walking with us. It wasn't a hunter. It didn't feel like prey either. It felt like something observing a ritual, as if it had done this before. The forest still hadn't made another sound. No birds, no wind. We might have been the only living things moving for miles, and yet it still felt crowded. Like we'd been joined by something old and unseen. Then, suddenly, silence. We took another step. No echo. Another. Still nothing. The absence was so sudden it felt like something had been yanked out of the world. We stopped, waited, listened. Just our own breathing and the whisper of leaves in the wind. The footsteps, whatever they had been, were gone. My friend turned around slowly, eyes scanning the woods like they might blink back at him. "Did it leave?" he whispered. "I don't think it ever really arrived," I answered. We camped that night earlier than planned, choosing a site near an overlook with no tree cover. Neither of us said much. We built a small fire and kept close. Sleep came in fits, full of half-dreams and imagined sounds. Every snap of a twig made us flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like movement. I kept waking, expecting to hear footsteps just outside the tent. But they didn't come back. Whatever it was, it had chosen that mile, and only that mile. The woods around us felt like themselves again. But we didn't let our guard down. We didn't talk about it the next morning, not in any serious way. Too easy to write off, too strange to unpack. "Ghost boots," my friend joked as we hiked, but his laugh was hollow. He kept checking over his shoulder. I did too, for days. You expect the wild to be full of animals, of nature, but not of presence. That's what we felt, not danger, not a predator, just a presence. And when something unseen walks with you through the woods, it leaves its prints somewhere deeper than the dirt. The trail wound through northern Massachusetts, close enough to Vermont that I could feel the pull of the border ahead. It was a perfect day for hiking. Blue skies stretched wide and endless, the sun warm but not oppressive. The path ahead was a straight shot, a ribbon of dirt cut clean through tall, sparse pines. There were no hills or valleys to block my view. Just open woods and a silence broken only by my steady steps. I had been walking for hours, settling into that quiet, meditative rhythm the trail offers after enough miles. The trees stood like watchful sentinels on either side, their shadows flickering gently over the packed earth. The world felt very still, like it was holding its breath. The kind of stillness that feels heavy, almost staged. It was in that odd, suspended moment that I first saw him. About 100 yards ahead, a figure appeared on the trail, standing completely still. He wore an old, oversized frame pack, the kind you rarely see anymore outside of vintage photos. His clothes struck me immediately. Short, 70s-style gym shorts, pale and almost glaring in the sunlight. There was something peculiarly deliberate about the way he stood there, as if waiting for something. I slowed down instinctively, not from fear, but from the sudden sense that something wasn't right. He turned his head slowly to look back at me, a small, almost imperceptible movement. For a breathless second, we made eye contact, or at least, I think we did. Then, without any real hurry, he stepped off the left side of the trail and disappeared into the trees. I quickened my pace, curiosity outweighing caution, my boots crunching louder against the dirt. When I reached the spot where he had been standing, I expected to see him slipping through the trees. The forest here was wide open, the pines spaced far apart, the ground covered in a thin carpet of needles. There were no rocks or thickets to hide behind, no hills or ravines he could have dropped into. But when I looked out into the woods, there was nothing. No figure, no sound, not even a stirring branch. It was as if he had been swallowed up, plucked from the world in the blink of an eye. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the silent woods, heart knocking a little harder in my chest. The emptiness felt sudden, deliberate, the kind of emptiness you notice too much. Logic crept in quickly, as it always does. He was probably just a section hiker, I told myself. Maybe he knew a shortcut, a hidden turnoff I hadn't seen, a path worn down by locals. I even pictured him laughing to himself, some seasoned wanderer playing a harmless trick on the new guy. Still, something gnawed at the back of my mind, a restless, shifting feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't just that he was gone. It was how he was gone. Like a light switched off, with no trail of footprints, no rustle of movement through the underbrush. Only the heavy quiet of the pines, standing tall and dumb and unhelpful. Only the soft, slow realization that I was alone again. Or maybe not quite. As I moved on, every crack of a twig or shift of a shadow made me turn my head. The woods that had seemed so friendly earlier now pressed in closer, whispering things I couldn't quite catch. I told myself stories to calm down, to flatten the oddness into something small and manageable. Maybe he was a local with an old love for retro gear, out enjoying the same sunshine I was. Maybe he didn't want to talk, didn't want to be bothered, and had hidden himself expertly. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the way he had looked at me, like he knew me somehow. Like he had been waiting for me specifically, on that straight stretch of trail, under that wide, empty sky. I picked up my pace without meaning to, needing distance without really knowing why. That night, in the lean-to shelter I found along the trail, I couldn't stop replaying it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sun glaring off those short gym shorts. I saw the gleam of the old metal pack frame catching the light, frozen in place ahead of me. Sleep came hard and thin, broken by long stretches of staring up at the black canopy overhead. The wind made the pines groan and creak in the darkness, as if the woods themselves were uneasy. I told myself, again and again, that it had been nothing, just a strange, random encounter. But the woods don't always let strange things go so easily. And neither does your own mind, once it's been invited to wonder. Later on, when I met up with some other hikers, I casually mentioned the guy I'd seen. One of them, an older man who knew the trails better than most, just raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you saw him, huh?" he said, a little too lightly, like someone trying not to spook a horse. They swapped glances, the kind that say more than words, a quick little dance of unease. Apparently, some folks had reported seeing a ghost hiker around that stretch for years. Always the same, old gear, outdated clothes, a sudden disappearance into the woods. I laughed along with them when they told me. What else was I supposed to do? But inside, something cold twisted just a little tighter. Even now, months later, sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I think about him. Not out of fear, exactly, but with a strange, lingering curiosity. I don't know, who was he? Or who had he been once? Was he a real man, flesh and blood, just living out his own story in solitude? Or was he something else, stitched into the fabric of the trail like a memory you can't quite touch? A spirit, maybe, who never stopped walking, never found the right road out. It was sometime in the early 80s, late summer if memory serves, when I set off alone into the backcountry. The trail was an old one, not heavily trafficked, winding through dense forest and broken up by narrow creeks. I carried a basic frame pack, a tent, and the quiet optimism of someone looking to escape for a few days. The air was warm and heavy, and the woods were loud with insects and the rustle of small animals. It had been hours since I'd passed another soul, and that was how I liked it. Solitude suited the trail. By late afternoon, I found myself descending into a low, wooded ravine, where a creek split the land. The sun filtered dimly through the thick canopy, casting long shadows over the mossy rocks below. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, and every sound echoed a little too clearly. I paused at the edge of the creek to fill my bottle, kneeling down beside the cool water. That's when I saw the movement, just a flicker, across the creek, in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, or a group of hikers setting up camp, but something made me stay still. On the opposite bank, maybe 40 yards out, a group of figures in black cloaks stood in a rough circle. There were 7 or 8 of them, maybe more, and they weren't moving like hikers. Their hoods were drawn, long and pointed, and they stood perfectly still, backs turned to me. Smoke drifted up from their center, pale and twisting, like incense or a fire just beginning to take. I crouched lower behind a fallen log, unsure whether to call out, walk away, or simply keep watching. The whole scene was too quiet, no bird song, no creek babble, just that smoke and those still figures. I felt a tightness in my chest that wasn't fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, sharper. Whatever they were doing, they hadn't noticed me yet, or they were pretending not to. Either way, I knew I wasn't meant to see what I was seeing. The longer I watched, the more surreal it felt, like I'd stepped into a page from some other world. They began to move slowly, raising their arms in unison as if responding to some signal I couldn't hear. The smoke pulsed upward, curling into unnatural shapes, almost like it had form and intention. No one spoke, but the rhythm of their motions suggested ritual, something practiced and old. One of them stepped into the center of the circle and knelt down. I couldn't see what they were doing. The others turned slightly, just enough that I caught a glimpse of one pale face beneath a hood. No expression, just blank, almost waxen, like someone carved it from candlelight. I ducked instinctively, heart pounding hard enough to make my ears ring. My instincts screamed to back away, but my legs felt locked in place. The woods, usually so alive, were watching too, or hiding something worse. I started inching back, careful not to break a branch or kick a rock across the bank. The moment I shifted my weight, one of them turned, fully, slowly, and looked directly across the creek. Not at me exactly, but right where I was hidden, like they knew without knowing. The rest continued, unaffected, as if the ceremony was more important than whoever watched it. But that one figure just stood there, head tilted slightly, as though listening to a thought not spoken aloud. The look wasn't threatening, but it wasn't indifferent either, more like acknowledgement. I could feel the weight of it, like being noticed by something that didn't belong to this time or place. It was enough to break whatever trance had kept me frozen. I turned and crept up the ravine slope, putting trees and elevation between me and that creek. Even after I could no longer see the ceremony, I could still feel its echo pressing at my back. I didn't stop until I'd hiked at least a mile uphill, lungs burning, heart still racing like a trapped animal. When I finally sat down on a rock to breathe, the woods had gone back to normal. Birdsong returned, and the wind moved through the trees like nothing had ever happened. It was almost insulting how quickly nature moved on, how little the forest cared what I'd seen. I kept thinking it might have been some harmless, strange group doing their own thing, but nothing about their stillness, their silence, or that strange moment of eye contact felt normal. It didn't feel like people playing at ritual. It felt like something far older than play, like they believed in what they were doing, and maybe more frightening, like it believed back. I camped far off trail that night, deep in a thicket, more alert than I'd ever been alone in the woods. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I told myself it was just a weird backwoods moment, not worth telling. But it stayed with me, carved into memory like bark into a tree. Over the years, I've told a few people, usually in passing or around campfires. Some laugh, some shrug, but a few go very quiet, like they've seen something too. They say that part of the forest has always had stories. Rituals, lights at night, disappearances. One guy said his uncle saw a group in robes out there in the late 70s, by a different creek. Another woman claimed she once heard chanting in the fog, but never saw the source. There's nothing on any maps, of course, just trails and creeks and old-growth forest. But those woods feel deeper than they look, and time seems to stretch in the quiet. Sometimes I wonder if I stumbled across a place that wasn't meant for me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, not for sure. But when I hike alone and I hear silence fall too quickly, I remember that smoke. I remember the stillness of those black hoods and the way one turned just enough. Enough to say, "We see you," without making a sound. It didn't chase me, didn't speak, didn't follow, and maybe that's what made it so much worse. The absence of threat made the moment linger. Not every strange thing in the woods wants to be found, and not all of them are ghosts. Some of them are flesh and bone, ancient rituals wearing modern faces. They come and go like fog over the trees, leaving no trace but memory. I had set out later than I meant to, chasing daylight up into the foothills, packed light and steps quick. The plan was to make camp before nightfall, but the trail had other ideas, longer, rougher than I remembered. By the time the last of the sun slid below the tree line, I was still 2 miles from the road crossing. Night came fast, as it does in the woods. No streetlights, no hum of the world, just black and breath. I clicked on my headlamp, the beam sharp and narrow, cutting a thin tunnel through the dark. The air was colder now, crisper, and every small sound rang louder than it should have. Somewhere, far off, I heard the cry of an owl, then silence so complete it felt deliberate. I focused on the trail, head down, boots hitting dirt in rhythm, trying not to think about what lay beyond the beam. But then I saw them. The first flash, low to the ground, 2 glowing eyes reflecting back. I stopped walking, just for a second, unsure if I'd imagined it, hoping it was just deer. Then another pair blinked to life, off to the right, and another behind a tree. Soon there were too many to count, scattered, watching, unblinking. Coyotes, I thought. A whole pack. Not running, not barking, just there. They moved low and quiet, almost fluid. Shadows that seemed to wait rather than stalk. I shouted, loud, sharp words. "Hey, get out of here!" and stomped my foot into the dirt. For a moment they paused. A few even lay down, almost playfully as if they were bored. But they didn't leave. They waited. Then, when I started walking again, they followed. Always just beyond the edge of the light. I tried not to panic, but I could feel adrenaline singing under my skin like static. Coyotes aren't wolves, I told myself. They're shy, they don't want trouble. But 8, maybe more? That's not a curiosity. That's a pattern, a test. The woods felt tighter now, the darkness heavier, like it leaned in with every step. I kept shouting, kept swinging my light in wide, angry arcs, trying to seem bigger, louder. Each time I did, the same routine. They'd pause, recline, wait. Like they were playing a game I didn't know the rules to. No growls, no snarls. Just those eyes, always blinking into view. They never came closer, but they never left. We moved together through the woods like two uneasy shadows sharing the same space. Sometimes I'd hear the crunch of leaves just off trail, or a soft shuffle in the underbrush. Other times I'd see only one pair of eyes, then suddenly 5, then none. I couldn't tell if they were circling or just drifting along with me, curious and quiet. The deeper into the night I hiked, the more surreal it became. I wasn't scared in the way you'd fear a threat, more like I'd been drawn into something strange. Like I was part of a silent ritual, an unspoken exchange between them and me. They weren't hunting, I don't think, but they were watching and they were waiting. I kept moving, step by step, heart pacing faster than my feet. The beam of my light began to feel smaller, as if the dark was learning how to swallow it. I just needed to reach the road. I'd marked the crossing earlier on my map, a gravel path where the woods opened up briefly. When I saw the pale line of it ahead, stretching across the trail, I almost laughed with relief. The moment I stepped onto it, everything changed. The eyes stopped. One by one, they vanished, flickering out like candles in the distance. No sound, no footsteps, just absence. I turned into place, scanned the tree line. Nothing. They hadn't followed me across. The road might as well have been a wall, and whatever rules they followed, that boundary was one they wouldn't cross. I stood there a while longer, breathing hard, watching the edge of the trees. It was quiet again, the kind of quiet that fills your ears and makes your heartbeat feel louder. The stars above the clearing looked clearer than they had all night. I finally moved on, leaving the woods behind me for a while, but not what I'd seen. It was just animals, I told myself again and again. Smart, curious, organized, but in the dark, with nothing but a beam of light and a pack full of noise, that logic wears thin. There was something else in that encounter, something like a test or a lesson. I hadn't passed it or failed it, I just walked through it. And when I think back on it now, it's not fear I remember most. It's the feeling of being watched and not being entirely unwelcome. Since then, I've hiked that trail again, but only in daylight and only with others. Sometimes I look into the tree line and wonder if they remember me. Coyotes aren't ghosts, but they're something more than just teeth and tails. They move between silence and presence in a way few things in the forest can. There's intelligence in their patience, something communal in their gaze. They let me walk, but they made sure I knew I wasn't walking alone. They don't chase, they don't speak, but they surround and they wait. Some things in the wild don't threaten. They observe. And some nights, when I hear leaves stir the wrong way, I remember how many eyes I couldn't see, and how few steps there were between mystery and mercy.